好。I would like to invite the Deputy Chair to speak first. Good afternoon. Today we are going to release the PAC report number 70. This report is thinner than previous reports. For 2 chapters of this report, they will be deferred. But the one on the rehabilitation of landfills and also the route number 8, they are more complicated. We need more time to write the report. So this PAC report will cover Chapter 3 on integrated education and some other chapters. There will be 2 more reports, which we will publish after the summer break. Today, what we want to talk about is integrated education. The report on integrated education is the subject today. And the member in charge of this particular part is Ms. Tanya Chan. Here's some background information. In the past 5 years, students with special educational needs increased by 37%. And in 2016-2017, according to the director for this report, 42,000 students were assessed to have special educational needs. And the Education Bureau spent some $1.4 billion on grants and allowances to these students, these SAN students. Our report covers some major areas, including how the Schools and Education Bureau identify these SAN students, how did we utilize the special grant. A few years ago, the Education Bureau launched this new scheme on learning support grant. So there were 2 systems in parallel. Both have merits and some disadvantages. And this report also covers the training for teachers supporting the integrated education system and whether sufficient resources are devoted to assist SAN students to learn. And we also look at whether in Hong Kong do we have sufficient educational psychologists to identify and assist SAN students. These are the major areas covered. For details, I'll defer to Ms. Tanya Chan. Thank you, Ms. Chan. Thank you, Deputy Chairman. We held 2 meetings on this subject. We invited the Education Bureau and relevant parties to attend the meetings. Many parents are very concerned about integrated education because it will not just affect the schools, the teachers and principals. It's also important for social and community inclusion. As the Deputy Chairman has said, we have seen an increase, a big increase in the number of SAN students and the resources utilized. There was an increase of 37%. And in terms of resources, 41% increase. Were the resources utilized appropriately so that appropriate support is given to the students? This is Chapter 3 of the director for this report. And there's a part on barrier-free lifts. Earlier this year, the government announced that $2 billion will be provided to support the replacement and and retrofitting program for barrier-free lifts. Some schools have encountered difficulties in the past, but now they are going to proceed with the lift programs. And we talk about the need to have early identification so that the student can receive services needed at an early stage. As present, they have a special information system on special education. We hope that this system can be accessed by more parties, because under this system, some personal data of the students are recorded, and also the support and service rendered since identification. We'd like to make use of this database system to track the progress of the student concerned. And also there's the issue of whether parents are willing to have the data of their children provided to another school, or when their children progress from primary to secondary schools. The rate of consent has increased very significantly, but it's just 90%. We have asked the government to consider an opt-out system, so that this particular system can be made available to more. We would like parents and schools to make available the information on SEND students to schools as early as possible. And lastly, I want to talk about the learning grant. And they have this intensive remedial teaching program for some classes, and they may also provide 1 to 3 additional teachers to schools. And now they want to transfer this particular program to another scheme, and that is the learning support scheme. We are concerned that why so few schools are willing to switch over to the new system. Out of 277, 35 have agreed to switch to the new LSG system. We know that the cash grant is very flexible, but at the same time it creates uncertainty. Under the ILTP, they have additional teachers. At least one more teacher will be provided. But for the LSG, it's in cash. It's up to the school to decide how to spend the grant. And the grant is determined by the number of SEND students. So much will depend on what the school decides to do. And also there are 3 tiers of the LSG with different ways of calculation. What's interesting is that we have discovered that the starting point, is calculated in a certain way. The government has failed to explain how they calculate the Tier 2 and Tier 3 grant. For example, for Tier 2, for every SNE student in 2016-2017 is $13,725 each. But the government could not tell us what's the initial level. There was a significant increase some years back, but they could not tell us how the first grant amount was calculated. And also for the first 1 to 6 SEND students, they would get $164,700. And then anything over that, they would get another grant, which is capped at 1.5 million something. So that's the same question here. What's the way to arrive at the initial basic grant amount? Although the government has increased the amount, but is it sufficient? So and we don't know why that there's an amount for the first 6 students, But then if there are more in need of Tier 3 support, they would get a grant which is subject to a cap. The government has promised to review the system. I think they would take into account the merits under the ILTP after talking to the schools, principals, teachers, and parents, so that in the future review or when they launch a revised scheme, they can take on board the merits under the ILTP, so that the future grant will be more targeted in providing support. And then we also look at the professional support and teacher training.
For 2017-18, when we look at integrated education, there are 9 types of conditions, and the 9th one is mental illness. It's newly added. But for the teachers' courses, mental illness is still a separated subject. So when teachers attend courses, maybe they would only learn some basic knowledge about mental illness. But if they want to know more about mental illnesses, they may have to take further courses. So for teachers, they may be too busy to take more courses. We hope that the government would take this into consideration. That is, for mental illnesses, this can be included into the teachers' trainings. We are also very concerned about the following points. We hope that the government can be very careful about this. That is, educational psychologists. We see that there is only a limited supply of educational psychologists. In Hong Kong, only Hong Kong U and Poly U provide courses for educational psychology, but we've heard that one of the universities will be pulling out, and the government says that maybe some other universities would like to take this up, but they only do it on alternate years. And one university would only provide a program in alternate years. So we are very worried about EPs. That is, there may not be enough supply of EPs because they are of huge demand in society. We hope that the relevant institutions can provide more programs in this area, because we hope that identification can be made further concerning certain students, and we need more EPs. Do any members want to supplement? Otherwise, we'll start to take questions. Okay, now I will open to the floor. Mr. Siu, do you want to add anything? Well, of course, I agree to this report, and at the meeting, I particularly mentioned this. For special education, in Hong Kong, we have 7.8% of the total number of students that need special education. This is quite a big number. I really would like to ask the question why. Now, for special education, they have a definition. So for people with learning difficulties, if they have ADHD, autism, they have speech and language impairments or intellectual disability, hearing impairments, physical disability, or even mental illness, or regarded as special educational needs. So these students face very different problems. Maybe we should teach them differently. Now, for ADHD or autistic students, they may have different severity. So how do you grade that? I really have queries. Supposedly, it's just a very mild case of ADHD or autism. If you label him so early, that would have a huge pressure on his family and the student himself. So I think the administration should really look at the definition more clearly. And also, there are students with mental illness. They are very different from ADHD students. So I hope that the government would really pay attention to this. Mr. Siu, thank you. This is Mr. Siu's view, and At the hearing, he also mentioned this. Mr. Lam Shak-ting, I really respect the education professionals. For SEN students, they have made a lot of contributions. In particular, I would like to point out that in the school year 2017-18, mental illness was included as SEN. I think it's too late. Now, for Hong Kong students, they are under huge psychological pressure, and we've seen student suicide cases. The number of student suicide is worrying, and there has been an upward trend. Only in 2017-18 did the government include mental illness as a type of SEN. I think this is not acceptable. And for students, we are very worried that the government's policy cannot help them. Now mental illness is included. We've noticed that for the government's relevant training works, they greatly lag behind. This is far from ideal. I hope that our government will pay more attention to SEN students, in particular students with mental illness. Supports should be enhanced. More resources should be allocated, and teachers should be given better trainings so that students can continue with the learning in a more appropriate environment, and their emotional pressure can be allayed. Any questions? For the audit report, it says that over 30% of the students were discovered that they were SEN students after primary 3. One reason is that there is a lack of EPs, but are there other solutions? Some of the students were only discovered in secondary schools. Well, for each and every case is different. Manpower is, of course, one of the problems. And for some children, when they are very young, the symptoms are not that obvious. Of course, this is not caused by one single reason. Well, can Ms. Tanya Chen explain to us more? How comes some students' problems are discovered so late? Well, of course, the government has explained, as the Vice Chairman pointed out just now. Well, some children's symptoms may develop late, and we may discover that they have special educational needs when they are in more senior forms. So once discovered, they would be assessed and provided with the relevant services. But the government has reiterated that if that is the case, they would give support to the students first, and then they will do the assessments later. So if the symptoms are clear, they would try to provide support first, and then they would ask the students to undergo assessments. We would not be speaking on behalf of the government, but we've heard this message. As far as we understand, if a school finds that a student has special educational needs, support will be provided first, and then they will proceed to assessment. But of course, it's not easy for all the students to be identified easily. So they may have to go through a number of years in school before they are identified. I am from RTHK, Alan. Well, the report, for the report, the strictest phrase is seriously concerned. it's not like in the past that you would reprimand or you would condemn. So for the Educational Bureau's work, you think it's actually quite positive. And even though you are doubtful, you think it's made its efforts. And sometimes the Education Bureau doesn't have enough resources to do what it wants to do. Is that right? And also for ILTP and LSG, you suggest that a new program be launched. So what should this new program include and how should it be launched? Well, this is the 6th year that I'm compiling such reports. So members would have to agree on the wording. So do we need to condemn or reprimand the government in every report? If so, then the word would lose its severity. So please spend some time reading the report. As for ILTP and LSG, how can they be improved? Well, of course, we would have some recommendations. Maybe I'll ask Ms. Chen to give you more details. I can only tell you in a simple way. As far as we understand, the government says that it's going to conduct a review, and some parents and some educators have a lot of views concerning this. I can't speak on their behalf. However, for schools, if you can provide a permanent teaching post, then it's much more stable for the schools. Then they do not have to fight for resources. The students are supported by certain services, and professional services can be provided to students. But for this permanent teacher, he can spend most of his time taking care of the needs of the students. And now there are some school visits and other services. Then the students' progress can be tracked. As I said just now, other than the ILTP and the LSG, we have explored the Special Education Management Information System.
但係唔多，而且咧能夠接觸到嘅亦都唔係咁多。咁當中其實喺個報告裏面咧都有包括咧就係話。
Well, yes, there are some assessment of the system that we have looked into why some of the information is not in the management database, and also the support. Sometimes the assessment is done not by the EP but by the schools, and we think such measures can be improved, so that we can also introduce systemic improvements, and also to make it more easy to utilize the grant, and so that will be more ideal.
Provided to public schools, basically. Do you think that that is not good enough, and should it be expanded to direct subsidy schools or even private schools? And the second question is regarding the lack of educational psychologists. What do you think can be done really to tackle this problem? Thank you.
I'll just give a very brief answer first, and then I'll pass it on to Tanya to answer the rest of the questions. Basically, I think I'll tackle the issue about education psychologists first. Yes, I think there is a lack of resources and supply of education psychologists, and of course, I mean, as Tanya has also mentioned just then, there are only 2 universities which offer the course on an alternate year basis. In the report, I think what the government intends to tackle the issue is to recruit more graduates from overseas universities. But of course, the other problem we are facing with education psychologists is that there is no unified, professional qualification, and I think various bureaus are working on it, whether we are talking about education psychologists or clinical psychologists, to establish a kind of more unified qualifications. Yeah, I think the recommendation of the report is that we should extend the grant and various types of aid to directly subsidized schools. This is the direction, but of course there is also a constraint on the resources. And I will let Tanya to supplement the answer.
Frankly speaking, we haven't really explored this point to a very large extent because I understand that the government has has limited resources. So at this moment, we hope that the government can improve the system within all these public schools, and at least because obviously this is a very important sources that most of the parents can access. So I hope that the government will use the resources efficiently and can improve the system as soon as possible, so as to help the number of students, the most number of students. But at this moment, in fact, we don't have any numbers or a number of students that are studying in the non-public schools. So and I understand that the government doesn't have these numbers as well. So it's quite difficult for us to predict. So what we are now focusing on is simply the public schools. But of course, the government can improve their system, at least to assess the data and the number of students that are studying in non-public schools. Regarding the educational psychologists, I think that's very, very, very important, and we are facing a very tough situation because we have a serious increase in the number of students who have special education needs, but then we don't have sufficient psychologists. And I understand that their remuneration, both in the government as well as in the market, are quite respectable. So I hope that the government will have a more advanced plan and to encourage the students to take these courses in order to assist the whole community. Thank you.
仲有問題啊，各位？冇問題啦嘛？或者
No further question? On the question of EPs, do you know the extent of shortage? We have given you some figures here. For educational psychologists, they have to visit different schools, and 5%. We have 844 schools in the public sector, and the EPs have to visit each one of them, but 42 of them, or 5% of them, are not reaching the target in terms of visits. Do you have any figures on EPs? We don't have the figure as such, but in respect of EP visit days, the fact that some schools have fewer visit days might or might not have to do with the number of EPs, because there are two types of visits. One is that the visits are arranged by the government or EB, or they are arranged by the school sponsoring bodies. Some school sponsoring bodies operate more than one school, and they would arrange visits by the EPs, their EPs. But for government EPs, they have to undertake administrative duties on top of visits. So if we have a consistent standards on visits for the two groups of EPs, then there will be more visits paid by EPs employed by the government, and the government would need to employ more EPs as a result. So we have seen an increase in the number of SEN students for 5 years now, so that we expect that more EPs will be needed. We want the government to make good preparation, offer more courses, and to encourage more people to be trained as EPs. Thank you. Goodbye.